Spare, Dr. Dick. You'll recall in the previous video, and you ought to have watched it, and if you haven't, you're extremely naughty, and you must stop this and go back and watch it. The fact is that I created a fictional scenario involving Mr. and Mrs. Wilson and Mary Wilson, with Mary Wilson possibly contemplating the appendage of Prince Harry according to the fact that Harry believed that so many people were fascinated with his penis and that it was a matter of public record. One of the strangest things that I have to admit I have ever seen a member of the royal family write about. And that includes much of the things that they've done in history. And believe me, if you want to find a fucked up bunch of people, just look at royal families out throughout the world. Anyway, leaving that to one side, he explained that when the 4 wounded soldiers got to the top of the world on the North Pole trek, they uncorked a bottle of champagne and drank to the Queen, and they actually telephoned Harry and let him listen in on their delight. They'd set a world record and raised a massive amount of cash. He congratulated them, said he missed them, and wished he'd been there. He explained, though, that this was actually a white lie. Ooh, another porky pie coming from Harry. At this point, he tells us that his penis was oscillating between extremely sensitive and borderline traumatised. Again, I don't think I've ever heard anybody write about their penis in such terms. And once again, this is demonstrative of the fact that his wife is letting him hang it all out there. Almost literally, really. And you've got to ask, is the ghostwriter involved at this point? Was J.A. Moehringer on a Zoom call thinking, are you fucking serious? I have written a critically acclaimed autobiography about Andre Agassi, a tennis great, with all the trials and tribulations that involved and the tumultuous relationship he had with his father, and here I am talking about Fantapubes's cock. Right, great. Well, I suppose the fee and what I'll do with it will somehow help me get through the pain and trauma of writing about Fantapubes's cock. It's astonishing that Harry feels the need to talk about this. He could have just explained that he suffered from frostbite and leave it there, or just make mention of the fact that he had frostbite in his nether regions and it was somewhat uncomfortable. But the fact that we get treated to its mention earlier on, it's mentioned again here, and of course the rubbing in of the cream while thinking of his mother incident, shows that this man has a huge preoccupation with his penis. It also shows a lack of awareness from him, which of course I would put down to the fact that he's not very bright, and it's this almost kind of thing of thinking, oh, what japes, I'll tell them about my penis. Everybody will think that's bloody funny. And of course, in a certain context, it might be. But repeatedly mentioning it and also putting it in the same sentence as thinking about your mother is really only ever going to have one reaction from people. One of distaste, perhaps even repulsion. The fact is, J.A. Moehringer might not have been involved at this juncture. Maybe Harry's wife had taken over. Or even if he was, who was giving the instructions that this nonsense ought to be included? Clearly, Harry thought that it was appropriate to do so. Anybody advising would have said, don't include it. I'm pretty sure all of you listening to me now would have said, well, if I was advising, I wouldn't have advised him to include it. I'd have said, leave that out. People don't want to know about this and make you look distasteful and stupid. Yet, of course, it was allowed to go in, and we all know why. Because his handler deemed that it was appropriate for him to make this disclosure that encouraged him to go down this route because it makes him look stupid, and he's told to do so that, of course, you'll look relatable. People will find it entertaining. Remember, he's in the sustained devaluation, and whilst this particular part was being written, in that particular Zoom call, she devalued him by encouraging to make this disclosure, or that when he did, she didn't rail against it. Harry explained that he'd been trying some home remedies, and we then get the recollection about applying the Elizabeth Arden cream and the fact that he thought about his mother. And he said that he took a smidge and applied it. Weird doesn't really do the feeling justice. Well, again, We file that under too much information, I would say. Harry then said that he needed to see a doctor ASAP. But he couldn't ask the palace to find him one. Why? Apparently, it's because some courtier would get wind of my condition, leak it to the press, and the next thing I knew, my Todger would be all over the front pages. Harry, I'm going to break this to you, pal. Your Todger is all over the front pages and has been as a consequence of you putting this in a book. Or is it the fact that you're allowed to break the news about your dick makes it all right? To my mind, that doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But it shows the hypocrisy and the idiocy of Harry, whereby he thinks, I can't see a doctor because it'll be leaked, but I'm quite happy for everyone to know about my Todger because I told them about it all. He then explained that he couldn't call a doctor on his own at random, probably because he doesn't know how to use a phone properly. So he recounts the scenario of, hi, Prince Harry here. Listen, I seem to be having a spot of bother with my nether regions, and I was just wondering if I could pop around. Well, you could do what most people do, is you make an appointment, and then when you see the doctor, you explain what the difficulty is. You don't necessarily need to explain it in advance. Or you could lie and say it's about something else, and then say, well, actually, there's something else while I'm here. I've been worrying about my tennis elbow, but whilst I'm here, my dick's not functioning properly. So apparently, he then asked a friend very discreetly to find a dermatologist who specialised in certain appendages. And his friend came back and said he knew just the bloke, so they raced off to Harley Street, and they snuck him in through the back door, and the doctor then suddenly realised who he was dealing with, and this was when he'd ordered him to step behind the curtain and take off his clothes. And he pulled back the curtain and then go, oh, it's you. So he examined him and then basically said, what's the problem? And he describes, I showed him my Todger softened by Elizabeth Arden. It's not very nice to Elizabeth Arden. I'm sure she's a smashing girl that would get anybody excited. Apparently, he then writes, he couldn't see anything, the doctor, which is not a very good follow-up, and someone's taking the piss out of Harry because it makes it seem like he's got a 2-inch stubber or a button mushroom. And apparently there was nothing to see because it was an invisible scourge. And consequently, he explained that his particular case of frost nip manifested as a heightened sensation rather than something to see. The doctor asked him how it happened, and he explained he'd been to the North Pole, although he doesn't actually describe precisely how it occurred, which would be interesting given the fact that he's put it all out there that he's got frost nip of the dick. You'd have thought that he would have been content also to share precisely how it occurred. There are some that are suggesting that he went out for a wee when he was pissed and fell over and passed out and buried his crown jewels in the snow. He then explained that everything was difficult. Sitting, walking and sex. The three things, of course, that Harry's at least managed to master. And he said that his Todger constantly felt like it was having sex. He really enjoys giving you all the detail here. And he explained that he'd done some Googling about the injury, and he said he'd come across some symptoms that he never really wanted to read about, and some horror stories about certain diagnoses that had occurred. And the doctor told him that it was unlikely that he would need one of those. He gave him a full examination, no stone unturned apparently, and he basically said, well, the likeliest cure is going to be time. And so Harry asks, what do you mean, time? Time, he said, heals. Really, Doc? That hadn't been my experience. So, brilliantly, Harry manages to link his own inner wounds as a consequence of the trauma of his mum dying, or once again, to an injury to his penis. He might have really described this as my penis and my mum, rather than spare. But maybe that will be a follow-up publication. Who knows? I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening. Up next, Flea. Who or what might that be?